The year 2001, 2002, I was on sabbatical in Jerusalem and was spending about 3 days a week, as much as I could physically handle, looking at liturgical microfilms in the Institute for Microfilmed Hebrew Manuscripts, to get the English name right, in the basement of the National Library in Jerusalem. And I was looking for a totally different project, but started noticing that there were words blacked out in the manuscripts, and these were consistently words in about 3 different prayers, plus some others occasionally. And so in the course of working on another project entirely, I started taking notes on what was happening with censorship of liturgical prayer books, of liturgical manuscripts in Jewish tradition, and became fascinated with the question of what happens when mandatory prayers are censored. What happens when external forces, and sometimes internal forces as well, say you've got to change the prayer, but it's a mandatory prayer. And how long is it going to take for this prayer to reach a new point of stability, a new sense of meaning based on what's been imposed from outside with censorship? And that led me to thinking, well, I'll write a nice article about this topic. That article got to be about 80 pages, and I realized, no, I've got to write a book. So that led to the production of this particular book. The challenges in the research had to do, first of all, just with the physical need to deal with microfilms. It's sort of brutal to sit staring at microfilms for 8 hours a day. The best microfilm collection, where they've collected microfilms of essentially every Hebrew manuscript throughout the world, is in Jerusalem, so one has to be there. There's also a substantial collection of manuscripts in the United States, particularly at the Jewish Theological Seminary, so I also went and worked with what they had there. But it was a matter of collecting the raw data on the liturgical history of the prayer, and then really to construct its, or to reconstruct its lived context was another challenge, and involved collecting materials, particularly in the early modern period of early printed materials, early printed books, much of which is now available digitally, so it's easier to get at and fun, but dealing also with materials in a number of different languages, some of which I had good control of, some of which I needed some help on. This book is on a topic which is really laid in the core of some elements of Jewish-Christian dialogue. To begin with, the topic of the book is a prayer called in Hebrew the Birkat HaMinim. And it's really that term is translated literally as a blessing of the sectarians, but in reality, it's a curse of the sectarians. And at times in its history, those sectarians were quite clearly Christians. So there was a theory put forward by a man named Louis Martin in the 1960s that when the Gospel according to John says that the Christians were being evicted from synagogues, that this was because Jews had at the same time instituted this prayer, the Birkat HaMinim. And he bases that on a passage in the Talmud which says that under Rabban Gamliel, who was the patriarch of the rabbis gathered at Yavne, or Jamnia in Greek, that they had instituted this prayer. He put 2 and 2 together and came up with 5, because we now think that the Gospel according to John was not written in a place where that prayer would have been known that quickly. And I also question significantly whether this tale of origins is actually historical. It first appears only in the Babylonian Talmud, which is redacted somewhere around the year 500, 600. So whether there's an actual tradition chasing that back to around the year 100 is much to be questioned. So one of the things I'm doing in this book is I'm addressing that question of the early origins of the prayer and whether it contributed at all to the partings of the ways between Judaism and Christianity. So that's locus number 1 for the discussion, which is of great interest. It's clear, by the way, that Jerome and Epiphanius, both around the year 400, know of this prayer because they make explicit reference to a prayer that is cursing at least Judeo-Christians, and they use the word mineum or mineorum, referring to minim, the word for sectarians. And they also refer to the use of the word, what comes out from the Greek and the Latin, as the Hebrew notzrim, which is the term for Christians, and they're objecting to that as well. So it's clear that the prayer exists in some form by then. It doesn't appear again in really serious form in Jewish-Christian discussions until the Middle Ages, when starting in 1240 or in the 1230s, in preparation for what turns out to be what's known as the Paris Disputation, a man named Nicholas Donin, who was a Jew converted to Christianity, includes this prayer in the list of charges against Jews and Judaism that he sends to the Pope, that results in the Pope calling for a sort of inquisitorial trial of the Talmud, and results ultimately in the burning of the Talmud and all sorts of Jewish books in 1242 in France. And then one has to move really into the 14th century, where one sees this prayer become a real issue as Christians begin to look at what Jews are doing rather than just Jewish thought about Jesus, but looking about what Jews are doing, and they are then raising significant critiques about this prayer. And what I've been able to do in the book then is, based on the actual manuscript evidence, say, well, what was this prayer at that point? We have texts from the Cairo Geniza, which is a repository of manuscripts from Egypt. Those texts date more or less to the 11th century and on. But I also then have looked at what manuscript evidence has been preserved from Europe, starting from a few manuscripts from the 12th century and then much more richly as one goes forward, to say, well, the prayer in Europe was a prayer that began with a curse of apostates. It continued with a curse of minim, which in the high medieval context quite clearly meant Christians. The word Christians had been removed in all forms that can be documented from Europe, but it was part of that line. Goes on to curse the enemies of the Jews, the enemies of Israel. And then the fourth line of the body of the prayer is a curse of what I jokingly call the evil empire. It's really the empire of insolence, or the arrogant empire, depending on how one wants to translate it, which of course refers locally to the ruling powers, if they're evil. So there's good reason why Christians, once they became conscious of this prayer, objected to its contents, because every single element of the prayer could be understood as being an anti-Christian prayer. In the context of the prayer itself, though, within its larger liturgical context, one needs to understand also that it was a prayer for the removal of those forces that are preventing the Jewish messianic vision from coming into effect. And that's really the way that it was intended within the Jewish context. But in any case, once one gets that medieval discussion, leads eventually with a sharpening of that discussion in the early 16th century, especially with the invention of print, and that print being used by people attacking the Jewish community quite significantly, to censorship developing because of church concern with print in general. It starts imposing censorship even in the 15th century to a certain extent on things being printed for the Christian world. And by the mid-16th century, 1550s, it imposes explicit censorship of Jewish books being printed within the realm of the Catholic Church, which is quite extensive. And very soon thereafter, Protestants impose the similar sorts of censorship. So this is what the point at which the actual texts of the prayer are changed, because a printer doesn't print a book that he can't sell. And so the things that are going to be printed will have a text that is acceptable to the censors. And the censors also, we know town after town after town in Italy at least, went and collected all Jewish books and required them to be expunged of things that the church found objectionable. So that's the point at which the manuscripts, if not before, It's the point at which the manuscripts are blacked out, sometimes corrected. Sometimes the original words are rewritten, but then they're recensored, so it happens again. And this blacking out sometimes was done by Jews, in which case it was done carefully because they had to do it in order to keep the books from being burned. Sometimes was done by the censors themselves, and I suspect those are the times where it looks like somebody licked a finger and just smeared the ink out. So we have a change in the text of the prayers that starts in the mid-16th century, and I've also then documented the changes. So the next stage is to say, okay, you've changed the texts that are written. What are people actually saying? And because prayers were significantly oral up to that point, not everybody had a book. Printing eventually makes books cheap enough that everyone has one. Prayers are oral, so changing what's written is not going to really change what's performed, or not going to change it so fast. So the question is, how soon does that happen, and when does it happen, and how does it happen? And that turns out to be, in some ways, one of the core questions of the book, but also a tricky question. Because is somebody looking over the shoulders of the people who are saying the prayer out loud to make sure that they're performing correctly? It's not evidence of that clearly until the 18th century in Prussia. But there are spies within the Jewish community, essentially, especially these people who have grown up in the Jewish community, are then converted to Christianity, often prove the authenticity of their conversions by informing on the Jewish community. So we have a set of polemical texts in the 16th and the 17th century which are accusing Jews about this prayer quite specifically and raising accusations. Those die off by the time you get to the end of the 17th century. 1688 is about the last one. And so I think that it's around then that Jews start actually using the printed text and accepting that as the prayer that becomes the known prayer. And there's evidence going forward from that point that that really is the prayer that people are talking about. They're writing interpretations about it. They're critiquing it in some ways, but trying to refine its language. And they're not going back, with few exceptions, they're not going back to the original text of the prayer. But there's still a consciousness that one's living, at this point one's coming into modernity, one's coming into a world in Europe particularly where Jews and Christians are trying to live in ways that Christians are going to find acceptable and meaningful. And they want to be accepted into Christian society, and the Enlightenment is beginning to open that door. So one begins to have a different level of internal critique of the prayer in the Jewish world, different kinds of critiques in different communities, but refinement of the language of the prayer by the time one gets to the beginnings of radical reforming of the religious traditions in general. There's some who are omitting the prayer in its entirety, and others who are rewriting it. So that what one moves to through this period is a prayer that's moved from being a curse, a medieval curse of Christians and Christendom, and to a certain extent Christianity even as a religion, but that's only implicit, to, by the 19th century, a prayer that's interpreted as being a curse of evil. And that becomes quite explicit in some of the 20th century reform retrievals of the prayer. So it becomes something which, while it's operating within a world of Jewish-Christian relations, it's no longer causing offense, and it's not, nobody wants to be saying a prayer that would be offensive. I showed the book to, I gave a copy of the book to the rabbi of the synagogue I attend, and there was a boy there talking to him, about 10 years old, and he looked at the book and he said, well, you know, why would anybody want to curse the Christians? Was this boy's response. And that's exactly what a contemporary response should be, because that's not part of the world we live in. But that's what was going on probably in the early medieval world, and certainly in the world of the High Middle Ages and into early modernity. with the question of what should the reader come away with, depends on which reader one's talking about in some ways. The person who's interested in doing Jewish liturgical history should be coming away with a whole set of methodological goals, which are embedded in the appendices and the sort of technical part of the book in terms of how do you learn about the history of Jewish liturgy through the medieval period. Very few people have looked at the whole swath of manuscripts and early editions to try to say what's the data and to establish that there is enormous variety in small details often, but significant details in many cases, of what Jewish prayers actually were. There's been a presumption of there being something standard with very little deviation from it. So that's one readership, and that's an important readership to me professionally, but that's probably a very tiny readership in terms of the book. The larger readership, it's looking for the Jewish world. I have a message about self-criticism. One of the things that has been enormously important in the development of renewed good relations between Jews and Christians has been the ability, the willingness of Christian dialogue partners in the Christian world in general to go through a period of really wrenching self-criticism, mostly in the wake of the Holocaust, to say what is it about Christianity that allowed horrendous things to happen to Jews in the midst of the Christian community. And how can we then address that and try to not make amends for the past, but make changes towards the future. There's been relatively little of that kind of self-critical work in the Jewish community. There's been a sense, well, we've been victims. We don't need to do the self-critical work. And to say, well, no, we've got pieces of our heritage that we do need to be self-critical about is definitely one of the goals of this book and some other liturgical work that I've done on some of the other prayers that came up in the same context, but were worthy of articles, not books. So that's a piece to say, to the Jewish world, we have a history that needs ownership as well, and we can't be always just sort of finger pointing and placing blame on dialogue partners. We need to be looking seriously at what the inside situation is within the Jewish community. And there are issues that go well beyond the liturgical that one could start to list there. And then it's just also the case of the history of this particular prayer, which in some ways itself is fascinating, and what this shows as a window onto how Jews and Christians have interacted through these various periods of interaction, from what little we can say through this prayer about the early periods of its formation, but then very much in a much bigger way in the medieval world and early modern and the modern world, and transformations in the relationship. So that's that larger piece in some ways is known, but not necessarily through this particular window.